The morning mist clung to the weathered headstones like whispered prayers, and Marcus Chin moved through Riverside Cemetery with the quiet reverence of a man who understood that every grave held someone's entire world. His work boots left gentle impressions in the dew-dampened grass as he carefully tended to the flowers that families had left behind, straightening arrangements that had been disturbed by the night wind and removing wilted blooms with tender precision. At 42, Marcus had learned that there was a sacred rhythm to this place, a peace that came from caring for those who could no longer care for themselves. His weathered hands, strong from years of physical labor, moved with practiced efficiency as he cleaned debris from around a small marble angel that marked a child's grave. The early morning light filtered through the ancient oak trees, casting dancing shadows across the pathway where he worked. Emma had asked him once why he chose to work in a cemetery, her 80-year-old curiosity genuine and unafraid. He had told her that it was important work, that families needed to know their loved ones were being watched over, but he had not told her the deeper truth. He had not explained how the silence here helped quiet the voices in his mind, the professional instincts that still stirred whenever he saw a child in need, the memories of a career he had walked away from when grief became too heavy to carry alongside his responsibilities as a single father. The sound of footsteps on gravel made him look up from his work, and he saw a small figure approaching through the morning haze. At first glance, Marcus thought it might be one of the neighborhood children taking a shortcut to school, but as the figure drew closer, he could see that this was different. The boy was perhaps 7 years old, his clothes rumpled and dirty, his dark hair uncombed and his face marked with the kind of exhaustion that no child should ever carry. Marcus straightened slowly, his instincts immediately alert. The boy walked with purpose but also with the careful wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. His shoes were worn thin at the soles, and his jacket was too large for his small frame, hanging loose around his shoulders like borrowed armor against a world that had proven itself unkind. The child stopped a few feet away from Marcus, his dark eyes holding a gravity that seemed far too old for his young face. He stood there for a moment, as if gathering courage, and Marcus could see the way his small hands trembled slightly at his sides. When the boy finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but the words carried the weight of desperate hope. "Sir, can you bury my sister?" the boy asked, and the simple question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat, his professional training immediately recognizing the signs of a child in crisis even as his heart struggled to process the implications of what he had just heard. He knelt down slowly, bringing himself to the boy's eye level, his movements careful and non-threatening. "What's your name, son?" Marcus asked gently, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had once helped him connect with countless children in far different circumstances. "Tommy," the boy replied, and Marcus could see him fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. "Tommy Rodriguez. And my sister is Sophia. She's 12, and she's been sick for a long time, and now she's not breathing anymore, and I don't know what to do." The words tumbled out in a rush, as if Tommy had been holding them inside for too long and could no longer contain the weight of his burden. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a familiar stirring of protective instincts that he had tried so hard to bury alongside his former profession. "Where is Sophia now, Tommy?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the alarm bells ringing in his mind. "At home," Tommy said, and then corrected himself with heartbreaking precision. "Not really home. The place where we've been staying. It's not far from here. I carried her there yesterday when she got too tired to walk, and this morning she just wouldn't wake up, and I knew she was gone because she felt different, cold and still." Marcus could see the boy's small body shaking now, whether from cold or shock or the overwhelming weight of grief and responsibility that no child should ever have to bear. The professional in him recognized the signs of prolonged stress and malnutrition, the way Tommy's clothes hung loose on his thin frame, the dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights spent watching over someone he loved. "Tommy, where are your parents?" Marcus asked carefully, already sensing the answer but needing to hear it confirmed. "They died in a car accident 8 months ago," Tommy said, his voice growing smaller with each word. "Sophia and me, we were supposed to go live with our aunt in California, but she said she couldn't take care of both of us because Sophia was too sick and needed too much help. So we ran away before they could separate us, and we've been taking care of each other ever since." The pieces began falling into place in Marcus's mind with horrible clarity. 2 orphan children, living on their own for months, one terminally ill and the other trying desperately to care for her while still being a child himself. It was the kind of situation that would have once mobilized every resource at his disposal, the kind of case that would have kept him awake at night until he found a solution. "Can you take me to Sofia?" Marcus asked, already knowing that he was crossing a line he had sworn never to cross again, stepping back into a world of child welfare and crisis intervention that he had left behind when his own wife died and he realized he could barely take care of his own daughter, let alone save other people's children. Tommy nodded eagerly, hope flickering in his tired eyes for the first time since their conversation began. "You'll really help us?" he asked, and the vulnerability in his voice made Marcus's heart clench with recognition of his own daughter's trust, the way children could still believe in the kindness of adults even after the world had shown them its cruelest face. "Yes, Tommy," Marcus said, rising to his feet and setting down his gardening tools with hands that he hoped weren't visibly shaking. "I'm going to help you. But first, I need to call my supervisor and let him know I'll be away for a while. And Tommy, when we get to Sofia, I might need to call some other people who can help us figure out the best way to take care of both of you." As they began walking toward the cemetery gates, Marcus found himself wondering where in the world people might be hearing this story unfold, whether it was mourning for them as it was for him and Tommy, or if somewhere across the globe someone was listening to this moment of unexpected connection while their own day was ending. The thought that others might be witnesses to this beginning somehow made the weight of responsibility feel both heavier and more shared. The morning sun climbed higher as they walked, and Marcus realized that his quiet life as a cemetery groundskeeper was about to become something far more complicated. But looking down at Tommy's small hand trustingly placed in his own, he found that for the first time in years, he was not afraid of that complication. Instead, he felt something he had almost forgotten how to feel, the sense that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Tommy led Marcus through streets that grew progressively more neglected as they moved away from the well-maintained cemetery grounds. The boy navigated with the confidence of someone who had learned every shortcut and hiding place in the neighborhood, his small feet moving quickly over cracked sidewalks and through narrow alleyways that Marcus would never have noticed on his own. They walked past abandoned storefronts with boarded windows and graffiti-covered walls, past empty lots where weeds grew tall between rusted chain-link fences. Marcus found himself studying Tommy's profile as they walked, noting the way the boy's jaw was set with determination that seemed far too mature for his 7 years, the careful way he checked over his shoulder periodically to make sure they weren't being followed. "Here," Tommy said finally, stopping in front of what had once been a small apartment building but now stood empty and condemned, its windows covered with plywood and official notices warning against trespassing. Tommy slipped around to the back of the building where a piece of plywood had been carefully loosened, creating an opening just large enough for a small person to squeeze through. Marcus hesitated for a moment, his adult frame clearly too large for the makeshift entrance, but Tommy had already disappeared inside and was calling back to him. "There's a door around the side that's unlocked," Tommy's voice echoed from within the building. "The one with the broken lock that the landlord never fixed." Marcus found the door Tommy had mentioned and stepped into what had once been someone's home but now felt like a cave carved out of urban decay. The electricity had been shut off long ago, but Tommy had placed candles in careful arrangements throughout the main room, creating pools of warm light that fought back against the shadows. The floor was swept clean, and Marcus could see that someone had made genuine efforts to create a livable space within the abandoned shell. In the corner, on a mattress covered with carefully arranged blankets, lay a small figure that Marcus immediately recognized as Sofia. Even in death, he could see the family resemblance between the siblings, the same dark hair and delicate bone structure, the same air of quiet dignity that Tommy carried despite his circumstances. Sofia looked peaceful, as if she had simply fallen asleep and might wake at any moment. Tommy had arranged her hands across her chest and covered her with what appeared to be their mother's quilt, a beautiful handmade piece that seemed to be one of the few valuable things the children had managed to keep from their former life. "She stopped hurting yesterday afternoon," Tommy said quietly, settling down beside his sister's still form with the easy familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours in that exact spot. I knew it was going to happen soon because she told me she could see Mama and Papa calling to her, and she seemed happy about it instead of scared like she used to be. Marcus knelt down beside the mattress, his trained eye taking in the evidence of Tommy's devoted care. There were medication bottles lined up neatly on a makeshift table constructed from stacked milk crates, each one labeled in Tommy's careful handwriting with dosage instructions and times. A notebook lay open nearby, filled with pages of meticulous records tracking Sophia's symptoms, her pain levels, when she had been able to eat and how much. "You've been taking care of her all by yourself," Marcus said, and it wasn't a question because the evidence was overwhelming and heartbreaking in its thoroughness. "She taught me how," Tommy replied, his voice steady despite the tears that had begun to track down his cheeks. "Before Mama and Papa died, Sophia was already sick, and she knew she was going to get worse. She made me promise that if anything happened to our parents, I would stay with her and take care of her until she didn't hurt anymore. She said it was the most important job in the world." Marcus felt his throat tighten as he looked around the makeshift home that these two children had created together. They had salvaged furniture from other abandoned units, arranged their few possessions with care, and somehow managed to survive for months in conditions that would have challenged most adults. The dedication and love evident in every carefully placed object, every thoughtful arrangement, spoke to a bond between siblings that had transcended their impossible circumstances. "Tommy, how have you been getting food, medicine?" Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer would be as resourceful and heartbreaking as everything else about this situation. "Sophia taught me how to read the labels at the free clinic, and they gave us her medicine when I brought her there every week," Tommy explained. "For food, there's a church 3 blocks away that serves meals on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and sometimes the lady at the corner store would let me sweep up in exchange for bread or milk. Sophia said it wasn't begging if I was working for it." The sophistication of their survival strategy amazed Marcus even as it broke his heart. These children had created systems and routines that had kept them alive and together for 8 months, had maintained Sophia's medical care and Tommy's basic needs through intelligence and determination that should never have been necessary. Looking at Tommy's thin face and the careful way he had arranged everything in their hidden home, Marcus realized he was witnessing something extraordinary disguised as tragedy. This 7-year-old boy had become caregiver, provider, and protector, had shouldered responsibilities that trained professionals sometimes struggled with, and had done it all out of love for his sister and a promise to keep their family together even when the world had tried to tear them apart. Marcus spent the next 2 hours making phone calls from his cell phone while Tommy sat quietly beside Sophia, occasionally reaching out to smooth her hair or adjust the quilt that covered her small form. The conversations were difficult, navigating bureaucracy and costs that Marcus had not anticipated when he first agreed to help, but something about Tommy's quiet dignity and unwavering devotion to his sister made turning away impossible. By early afternoon, Marcus had arranged for Sophia to be transported to Riverside Cemetery with the same care and respect that would be given to any beloved family member. He had paid for the services from his own modest savings, money that had been set aside for Emma's school supplies and their small apartment's monthly expenses, but the decision felt inevitable rather than sacrificial. Tommy insisted on helping to prepare Sophia for her final journey, his small hands gentle as he combed her hair and arranged the simple dress that had been their mother's favorite, a pale blue cotton garment that Sophia had insisted on keeping despite its being far too large for her diminished frame. Marcus watched in amazement as the boy performed these tasks with the composed grace of someone much older, speaking to his sister in soft whispers as if she could still hear every word. "You're going to be in a beautiful place," Tommy told Sophia as he placed a small stuffed rabbit beside her, the toy's fur worn smooth from years of devoted attention. "There are trees and flowers, and the man who takes care of everyone there is very kind. You won't be alone, and you won't hurt anymore, and someday when it's my time, I'll come find you and we'll be together again." The funeral director, an elderly man named Harrison who had worked with Marcus many times over the years, treated Tommy with the same respectful consideration he would show any grieving family member. He explained each step of the process in language that was honest but gentle, answering Tommy's questions with patience and allowing the boy to make decisions about details that mattered to him. At the graveside service, Marcus was surprised to see several other people in attendance. Mrs. Rodriguez from the corner store had closed her shop for an hour to pay her respects, tears streaming down her weathered face as she explained to Marcus how Tommy had swept her floors every week with the serious concentration of a much older child. The nurse from the free clinic had come as well, bringing with her 2 other staff members who remembered Sophia's brave smile during her weekly visits. Pastor Williams from the neighborhood church spoke words of comfort that acknowledged both Sophia's suffering and her courage, her love for her brother and the remarkable family bond that had sustained them through months of impossible circumstances. Tommy listened with solemn attention, his small hand placed trustingly in Marcus's larger one, his 7-year-old frame straight and dignified despite the weight of his grief. When it came time for Tommy to say goodbye, the boy approached the simple wooden casket that Marcus had selected with the same careful composure he had shown throughout the day. He placed a folded piece of paper beside the stuffed rabbit, a letter he had written to Sophia during the quiet hours of the morning while Marcus made arrangements. "I kept my promise," Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible even to Marcus who stood close beside him. "I took care of you until you stopped hurting, and I made sure you would have a beautiful place to rest. I'm going to miss you every day, but I'm not scared anymore because I know you're safe now." Marcus felt tears sting his own eyes as he watched this extraordinary child display strength and grace that many adults could not manage under similar circumstances. Tommy's composure was not the brittle false bravery of someone trying to be strong, but rather the genuine peace of a boy who had fulfilled a sacred obligation and could now allow himself to grieve. After the other mourners had departed and the cemetery workers had completed their tasks, Tommy asked if he could stay a little longer. Marcus settled beside him on the grass, understanding instinctively that this moment of transition needed to unfold at Tommy's own pace, without pressure or artificial time constraints. They sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon sun filtered through the oak trees, casting gentle shadows across the freshly turned earth. Tommy seemed to be having a private conversation with Sophia, his lips moving soundlessly as he shared thoughts and feelings that were meant for his sister alone. Finally, Tommy turned to Marcus with eyes that held both sadness and something that might have been relief. "She's really at peace now, isn't she?" Tommy asked, and Marcus recognized the question of a child who needed adult confirmation that his difficult decision had been the right one. "Yes, Tommy," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had spent years helping families navigate loss and grief. "Sophia is at peace, and she's proud of how well you took care of her. You gave her the most precious gift anyone can give, which is to be loved and never alone during the hardest time of her life." Tommy nodded solemnly, then surprised Marcus by reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small key attached to a worn piece of string. "This was to the place where we lived," Tommy said, holding the key out to Marcus. "I don't think I want to go back there anymore. It was perfect when Sophia was with me, but now it just feels empty and sad." Marcus accepted the key, understanding that Tommy was not just handing him a piece of metal but rather making a decision to leave behind one chapter of his life and trust someone else to help him write the next one. The gesture carried weight far beyond its simplicity, representing both ending and beginning, loss and hope intertwined in the way that only children seem to understand intuitively. That evening, Marcus brought Tommy home to the small apartment he shared with Emma, knowing that the boy could not return to the abandoned building and uncertain about what other options existed. Emma had greeted Tommy with the unguarded warmth that 80-year-olds possessed, immediately insisting that he sit beside her at the dinner table and asking gentle questions about his favorite foods and games while carefully avoiding any mention of loss or sadness. Marcus watched his daughter's natural compassion with pride and something that might have been professional admiration, recognizing in her behavior the same instinctive understanding of trauma-informed care that he had once taught to graduate students and social work colleagues. Emma seemed to know without being told that Tommy needed normalcy and acceptance rather than sympathy or special treatment. After dinner, while the children worked on a puzzle together in the living room, Marcus excused himself to make phone calls from his bedroom. The first call was to his former supervisor at the Department of Children and Family Services, a conversation that felt strange after 3 years of silence but which yielded important information about Tommy's legal status and the complex process that would be required to ensure his safety and stability. The second call was more difficult, reaching out to Dr. Sarah Martinez, who had been his closest colleague during his years as a child psychologist. Sarah's voice carried warmth and concern as she listened to Marcus describe Tommy's situation, but also surprise at hearing from someone who had disappeared so completely from their professional community after his wife's death. "Marcus, this child sounds remarkable, but you know the system well enough to understand that his situation is complicated," Sarah said during their lengthy conversation. "He's been living independently for months, which means CPS will need to conduct a thorough investigation. There will be questions about why he didn't seek help sooner, about his ability to care for himself, about what kind of placement would be most appropriate for his needs." Marcus found himself pacing his small bedroom as Sarah outlined the potential challenges that lay ahead. Tommy's remarkable competence and maturity, which had enabled him to survive and care for Sophia, might actually work against him in a system that was designed to protect children who fit more conventional patterns of vulnerability and dependence. "The problem is that social workers are trained to look for certain indicators of neglect and trauma," Sarah continued, "and Tommy doesn't present like most children who have been living without adult supervision. His intelligence and self-sufficiency might make some people question whether he really needs intervention, or conversely, whether his situation has been more harmful than it appears on the surface." Marcus understood the implications immediately. Tommy's extraordinary coping skills, which were actually a vide NCE of his resilience and strength, could be misinterpreted as signs that he had not been significantly impacted by his circumstances, or alternatively, as indication that he had been forced to mature too quickly in ways that might require extensive therapeutic intervention. After ending the call with Sarah, Marcus returned to the living room where he found Tommy and Emma had completed their puzzle and were now sitting quietly on the couch, Emma reading aloud from one of her favorite books while Tommy listened with the focused attention of someone who had not heard bedtime stories in many months. "Tommy," Marcus said gently, settling into the chair across from them, "I need to talk with you about what happens next. Tomorrow, I'm going to contact some people whose job it is to help children who don't have parents, and they're going to want to ask you questions about how you and Sophia were living, and what kind of home you'd like to have now." Tommy looked up from the book, his dark eyes serious but not afraid. "Will they try to separate me from you and Emma?" he asked with the directness that Marcus was learning to expect from this remarkable child. "I don't know yet," Marcus answered honestly, recognizing that Tommy deserved truth rather than false reassurance. "That will depend on a lot of things, including what they think would be best for you and whether they believe I'm qualified to take care of you properly." Emma looked back and forth between Marcus and Tommy with growing understanding, her 80-year-old mind processing the implications of their conversation. "Daddy, why wouldn't you be qualified?" she asked with the innocent logic of childhood. "You take care of me really well, and Tommy needs the same things I need, like food and hugs and help with homework." Marcus felt his heart clench at his daughter's simple assessment, recognizing the profound truth in her observation while also understanding how complex the bureaucratic reality would be. Emma saw Tommy as a potential brother who needed inclusion in their family, but the system would see him as a case requiring careful evaluation and placement according to regulations and procedures that prioritized legal compliance over emotional connection. That night, after both children were asleep, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, writing down everything he could remember about Tommy's situation and his own observations of the boy's remarkable capabilities. The exercise felt familiar in a way that was both comforting and painful, activating professional skills that he had deliberately set aside but which now seemed essential for protecting this child who had somehow become his responsibility. Marcus found himself documenting Tommy's emotional stability, his problem-solving abilities, his sophisticated understanding of medical care and basic survival skills. He noted the boy's capacity for forming healthy attachments, as evidenced by his bond with Sophia and his quick acceptance of Emma's friendship. He recorded signs of resilience and hope despite prolonged stress and grief. As he wrote, Marcus realized that he was essentially conducting the kind of comprehensive assessment that he had performed hundreds of times during his career, but which now felt more personal and urgent than any case he had handled as a professional. Tommy was no longer just a child in need of services, but a boy who had somehow become part of Marcus's family during the course of a single day, a transformation that felt both sudden and inevitable. The next morning, Marcus called the Department of Children and Family Services before his shift at the cemetery, explaining Tommy's situation to the intake worker with careful attention to detail. He provided his address, described the circumstances of Sophia's death, and outlined Tommy's immediate need for safe placement while longer-term arrangements could be determined. The intake worker, a harried-sounding woman named Janet, seemed more focused on completing her forms than understanding the nuances of Tommy's situation. She scheduled a home visit for that afternoon and warned Marcus that he should not have taken Tommy without proper authorization, though she acknowledged that emergency circumstances sometimes required immediate action. Marcus spent his morning shift at the cemetery working mechanically, his mind occupied with preparations for the afternoon meeting. He had cleaned his apartment thoroughly the night before, organized Tommy's few possessions in the small corner of Emma's room where the boy would sleep, and reviewed in his mind the key points he wanted to communicate about Tommy's remarkable resilience and capabilities. At exactly 2 o'clock, Director Patricia Hayes arrived at Marcus's apartment building in a county vehicle, her clipboard and briefcase suggesting official business conducted with maximum efficiency and minimum personal investment. She was a thin woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to catalog potential problems rather than recognize individual humanity. Hayes knocked briskly on the apartment door, then entered when Marcus opened it with the bearing of someone conducting an inspection rather than making a social visit. Her gaze swept across the small living space, taking note of the modest furnishings, the children's books scattered on the coffee table, and Tommy sitting quietly beside Emma on the couch. "You must be Tommy Rodriguez," Hayes said, approaching the boy with professional detachment. "I'm Director Hayes from Child Protective Services, and I need to ask you some questions about your living situation. Can you tell me how long you've been staying with Mr. Chen here?" Tommy looked up at her with the same serious attention he gave to all adult conversations, his dark eyes alert and respectful. "Since yesterday evening," he answered clearly. "After we buried my sister Sophia at the cemetery where Mr. Chen works." Hayes made notes on her clipboard, her pen moving efficiently across official forms. "And before that, you were living where exactly?" Tommy began to describe the abandoned building where he and Sophia had made their home, but Hayes interrupted him repeatedly with specific questions about utilities, sanitation, and safety hazards. Her tone suggested that she was documenting evidence of neglect and endangerment rather than trying to understand the remarkable survival story that Tommy was attempting to share. Marcus watched the interaction with growing concern, recognizing that Hayes was approaching Tommy's situation through the narrow lens of regulatory compliance rather than seeing the broader picture of two children who had created a functioning family unit under impossible circumstances. The director's questions focused on deficiencies and problems rather than strengths and capabilities. "Mr. Chen," Hayes said, turning her attention away from Tommy with dismissive finality, "I need to speak with you privately about proper procedures for reporting abandoned children." "Tommy, you can continue playing with your friend while the adults talk." Marcus felt his jaw tighten at Hayes's casual dismissal of Tommy as simply an abandoned child and her assumption that serious conversations should exclude the very person whose future was being discussed. He recognized the approach as typical of bureaucrats who prioritized institutional efficiency over individual dignity, but experiencing it directed toward Tommy felt particularly offensive. In the kitchen, Hayes began explaining the formal process that would determine Tommy's placement, outlining a series of evaluations, home studies, and court proceedings that could take months to complete. She spoke about Tommy as a case number rather than a child, referencing his file and discussing placement options that seemed to prioritize administrative convenience over emotional stability. "The boy will need to be placed in emergency foster care while we conduct our investigation," Hayes explained with the detached efficiency of someone who had delivered similar news hundreds of times before. "We have several approved families who specialize in short-term placements for children who require evaluation." Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, a protective instinct that was both professional and deeply personal. "What kind of evaluation are you planning?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the anger building behind his calm exterior. "Standard psychological assessment, educational evaluation, medical examination," Hayes replied, consulting her clipboard as if reading from a script. "We need to determine the extent of trauma and developmental delays resulting from his prolonged period without proper adult supervision." The phrase proper adult supervision hit Marcus like a slap, carrying implications that Tommy had been neglected or abandoned rather than heroically cared for by his sister and his own remarkable capabilities. Hayes's assumption that Tommy would naturally be damaged by his experiences revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of his strength and resilience. "Director Hayes," Marcus said, his voice taking on a tone that he had not used in years but which felt familiar and appropriate, "I think you may be approaching this situation with some misconceptions about Tommy's experiences and capabilities. Have you reviewed the medical records from the free clinic where he took Sophia for care? Have you spoken with the people in the community who know him?" Hayes looked up from her clipboard with slight irritation, as if Marcus had interrupted an efficient process with unnecessary complications. "Mr. Chen, I appreciate your concern, but I've been doing this work for over 20 years. I know how to assess a child's needs and determine appropriate placement. You're a cemetery worker, not a trained social services professional." The dismissal was casual and complete, delivered with the unconscious arrogance of someone who believed that job titles determined competence and that Marcus's humble employment automatically disqualified him from having useful insights about child welfare. Hayes returned her attention to her forms, clearly considering the conversation concluded. Marcus felt the familiar stirring of professional indignation, the same reaction he had experienced years earlier when encountering colleagues who let bureaucratic efficiency override individual care. But this time, the stakes felt higher and more personal because Tommy was not just a case study but a child who had somehow become part of his family. Despite Marcus's objections and Tommy's quiet plea to stay with Emma and him, Hayes insisted on removing Tommy that same afternoon for placement in what she termed emergency protective custody. The foster home she had selected was run by Mrs. Brennan, a woman in her 60s who managed a state-approved facility that specialized in short-term placements for children awaiting permanent arrangements. Marcus watched helplessly as Hayes loaded Tommy's few possessions into a plastic garbage bag, the casual treatment of the boy's treasured items serving as a stark symbol of the system's inability to recognize individual dignity. Tommy accepted the transition with the same quiet composure he had shown throughout their brief time together, but Marcus could see the disappointment and confusion in the child's dark eyes. Before Tommy left, he hugged Emma goodbye with the careful formality of someone who understood that promises about future reunions might not be reliable. Emma cried openly, asking why Tommy couldn't stay with them if their apartment was big enough and if he was happy being part of their family. Hayes explained impatiently that proper procedures required professional evaluation and that children could not simply be placed based on emotional preferences. The next 3 days passed slowly for Marcus, who found himself distracted at work and anxious about Tommy's adjustment to his new temporary home. On Thursday evening, he decided to visit the boy at Mrs. Brennan's facility, a large older house that had been converted to accommodate up to 8 children in various stages of placement transition. Mrs. Brennan met Marcus at the front door with the efficient politeness of someone managing multiple challenging situations simultaneously. She explained that Tommy was adjusting adequately to their routine, though she noted that he seemed quieter and more withdrawn than most children in their first few days of placement. "He's very polite and follows all the rules," Mrs. Brennan said as she led Marcus through the house toward the common room where the children spent their evening hours. "But he doesn't really engage with the other kids or participate in activities. He just sits and reads or stares out the window. I've seen that kind of behavior before in children who have experienced significant trauma." Marcus found Tommy sitting alone in a corner of the common room, a book open on his lap but his attention focused on something beyond the window that looked out onto a busy street. The other children in the room were watching television or playing board games, their chatter and laughter creating a background noise that seemed to emphasize Tommy's isolation rather than include him in their community. When Tommy saw Marcus, his face brightened with genuine happiness for the first time since their separation, but he remained seated until Marcus approached and knelt down beside his chair. The careful restraint in Tommy's greeting told Marcus everything he needed to know about the boy's understanding of his precarious situation and his fear that excessive enthusiasm might somehow jeopardize his chances of maintaining connections with people he cared about. "How are you doing here, Tommy?" Marcus asked gently, settling cross-legged on the floor beside the chair so that they could speak at eye level. "It's fine," Tommy replied with the diplomatic neutrality of someone who had learned not to complain about situations beyond his control. "Mrs. Brennan is nice, and there's always enough food, and I have my own bed. It's much better than some places we had to stay when Sophia and I were on our own." Marcus recognized the comparison as Tommy's way of expressing gratitude while also communicating that this placement, however adequate, was not the same as being part of a family. The boy's careful positivity reflected his understanding that adults expected children to be grateful for basic care, even when that care lacked the warmth and individual attention that every child deserved. "Do you miss Emma?" Marcus asked, knowing the answer but wanting to give Tommy permission to express feelings that he might be suppressing in order to appear well-adjusted. Tommy's composed facade cracked slightly, and Marcus could see tears gathering in the boy's eyes before he blinked them away with characteristic determination. "I miss both of you," Tommy said quietly. "Emma was teaching me a card game, and I was going to show her how Sophia taught me to braid friendship bracelets. I keep thinking of things I want to tell you about, but then I remember that you're not there anymore." The simple honesty of Tommy's response hit Marcus with unexpected force, crystallizing his growing understanding that this remarkable child needed more than adequate care and professional evaluation. Tommy needed family, needed the kind of unconditional belonging that could not be provided through institutional placement, however well-intentioned. Marcus spent an hour with Tommy, helping him with homework and listening to his careful descriptions of daily routines at Mrs. Brennan's facility. The boy's adaptive capabilities were evident in how quickly he had learned the house rules and schedules, but Marcus could also see the emotional cost of constantly adjusting to new environments and expectations. When it came time to leave, Tommy walked Marcus to the front door with the same polite formality he had shown upon arrival. Mrs. Brennan hovered nearby, clearly monitoring their interaction for signs of difficulty or inappropriate attachment that might complicate Tommy's adjustment to temporary placement. "Tommy," Marcus said as they reached the door, "I want you to know that Emma and I think about you every day, and we're working on finding a way for our family to be together again. It might take some time because there are rules and procedures that have to be followed, but I'm not giving up on that possibility." Tommy nodded solemnly, his dark eyes holding a mixture of hope and wariness that broke Marcus's heart. "I understand about rules and procedures," Tommy said with the wisdom of someone who had learned to navigate complex systems at far too young an age. "I'll try to be patient and not cause any problems that might make things harder." As Marcus drove home through the evening darkness, he found himself thinking about the question he knew viewers around the world might be asking themselves, wondering what part of this story resonated most deeply with their own experiences of bureaucracy and human connection, their own memories of feeling dismissed or undervalued by systems that claimed to help but often seemed to prioritize efficiency over empathy. Marcus began visiting Tommy every evening after his shift at the cemetery, a routine that Mrs. Brennan tolerated with increasing reluctance as the days stretched into weeks. She expressed concern that Marcus's frequent presence was preventing Tommy from forming appropriate attachments to his temporary placement and might be creating unrealistic expectations about his future living arrangements. During these visits, Marcus discovered layers of Tommy's personality that had been hidden during their brief initial time together. The boy possessed an extraordinary curiosity about the world, asking thoughtful questions about Marcus's work at the cemetery, about the different types of trees and flowers that grew there, about the stories that headstones could tell about the people who rested beneath them. Tommy also revealed an unexpected artistic talent, sketching detailed drawings in a notebook that he had somehow managed to keep throughout all his transitions and upheavals. His drawings showed remarkable attention to detail and emotional depth, depicting scenes from his life with Sophia, portraits of people who had shown them kindness, and increasingly, pictures of Emma and Marcus and the brief glimpse of family life he had experienced in their small apartment. One evening, as they sat together in the common room while the other children watched television, Tommy showed Marcus a drawing he had completed that afternoon. It depicted the cemetery where Sophia was buried, but Tommy had drawn it as it might look in springtime, with flowering trees and gardens full of colorful blooms, a peaceful and beautiful place where Sophia could rest surrounded by natural beauty. "I thought maybe, if it's okay with you, I could help plant some flowers near Sophia's grave," Tommy said, his voice carrying the careful hopefulness of someone who had learned not to assume that his ideas would be welcomed. "She always loved gardens, and our mama used to grow roses in pots on our apartment balcony before she and Papa died." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest as he looked at Tommy's drawing and listened to his gentle proposal. The boy's desire to care for his sister's resting place revealed the same devotion and maturity that had enabled him to provide such remarkable care during Sophia's final months, but it also showed his need for ongoing connection and purpose that went far beyond basic survival. "I think that's a wonderful idea, Tommy," Marcus replied, studying the careful detail in the boy's artwork. "Sophia would love knowing that you're still taking care of her, and I know exactly where we can find the kind of flowers that would grow well in that spot." Tommy's face brightened with the first genuine smile Marcus had seen since their separation, and for a moment the careful composure that the boy maintained as protection against disappointment gave way to the excitement of a 7-year-old planning a special project with someone he trusted. Over the following days, Marcus found himself looking forward to their evening conversations with an intensity that surprised him. Tommy's questions about life and death, about family and loss, about hope and resilience, often demonstrated insights that would have been remarkable coming from someone much older. The boy had clearly spent considerable time thinking about profound concepts during his months of caring for Sophia, developing a philosophical maturity that coexisted with his childlike wonder about simple pleasures. Mrs. Brennan grew increasingly vocal about her concerns regarding Marcus's involvement in Tommy's daily life. She complained to Director Hayes that the frequent visits were disrupting their facility's routine and preventing Tommy from adapting properly to institutional care. She suggested that Marcus's attachment to the boy was inappropriate and potentially harmful to Tommy's long-term adjustment. "Marcus, you need to understand that maintaining this level of contact is not in Tommy's best interest," Mrs. Brennan explained during one of their increasingly tense conversations. "Children in temporary placement need to learn that they cannot depend on relationships formed during crisis situations. Tommy needs to focus on adjusting to our program and preparing for whatever permanent placement the department determines is most appropriate." The suggestion that his relationship with Tommy was somehow harmful or inappropriate struck Marcus as both professionally ignorant and personally offensive. He recognized Mrs. Brennan's concerns as reflecting the institutional bias toward emotional detachment that he had encountered throughout his career in social services, the misguided belief that preventing attachment somehow protected children from future disappointment. "Mrs. Brennan," Marcus replied with carefully controlled patience, "Tommy has already experienced more loss and disruption than most children endure in a lifetime. What he needs now is stability and consistent relationships with adults who care about him as an individual, not preparation for further abandonment." Mrs. Brennan's expression tightened with disapproval at Marcus's challenge to her professional expertise. "Mr. Chen, with all due respect, you're a groundskeeper, not a trained child welfare professional. Tommy needs therapeutic intervention and structured programming, not emotional attachment to someone who cannot provide appropriate long-term placement." The dismissal was delivered with the same casual condescension that Marcus had encountered from Director Hayes, the automatic assumption that his job title determined his level of understanding about children's needs. Mrs. Brennan clearly viewed his concerns as well-intentioned but uninformed interference in processes that required professional expertise to manage properly. That evening, as Marcus helped Tommy with his homework at one of the small tables in the common room, he noticed that the boy seemed more subdued than usual, his responses shorter and his attention less focused than normal. When Marcus asked if something was troubling him, Tommy looked around carefully to make sure they would not be overheard before speaking. "Mrs. Brennan told me today that I shouldn't get too attached to people who visit me because it makes it harder when I have to move to my permanent home," Tommy said quietly. "She said that caring too much about temporary relationships is not healthy for children in my situation." Marcus felt anger flash through him at Mrs. Brennan's misguided attempt to protect Tommy by discouraging the very connections that might provide him with hope and stability. The institutional approach to emotional management struck him as not only wrong but potentially harmful to a child who had already learned to guard his heart against repeated losses. 3 weeks after Tommy's placement at Mrs. Brennan's facility, Marcus received a phone call that changed everything. Director Hayes informed him that they had identified a long-term foster family in another county who specialized in caring for children with complex needs, and that Tommy would be transferred there within the week to begin what she termed a more appropriate therapeutic placement. "The family has extensive experience with children who have experienced significant trauma," Hayes explained with the detached efficiency that Marcus had come to recognize as her standard approach to human complexity. They live on a working farm where Tommy can benefit from structured activities and rural environment that will help him process his experiences in a healthy setting. Marcus felt his stomach clench as he listened to Hayes describe the placement as if it were an obvious improvement over Tommy's current situation. The farm was nearly 2 hours away from his cemetery, which would make regular visits impossible, and the therapeutic focus suggested that the family viewed Tommy primarily as a damaged child requiring intensive intervention rather than a resilient boy needing loving stability. Director Hayes, I'd like to request a meeting to discuss alternative placement options for Tommy, Marcus said, his voice carefully controlled despite the urgency building inside his chest. I believe there may be other arrangements that would better serve his needs and maintain the supportive relationships he's already established. Hayes's response carried the impatient tone of someone explaining obvious facts to someone too naive to understand basic realities. Mr. Chen, I appreciate your interest in Tommy's welfare, but placement decisions are made by trained professionals based on comprehensive assessments and available resources. The Hendricks family has been approved by the state and comes highly recommended by our Therapeutic Services Department. Marcus understood that Hayes was following established procedures and utilizing resources that had been developed through years of institutional experience, but he also recognized that those same procedures were failing to account for Tommy's individual strengths and specific needs. The system was designed to process cases efficiently rather than to recognize the unique circumstances that might require creative solutions. I understand the importance of proper procedures, Marcus replied, drawing on reserves of professional diplomacy that he had not used in years, but I'd like to ensure that all of Tommy's needs are being considered in this decision. Has anyone conducted a comprehensive evaluation of his current emotional state and his preferences regarding placement? Hayes paused for a moment, clearly consulting her files and reviewing the documentation that had been completed during Tommy's time in temporary care. The standard psychological evaluation was conducted last week, and Tommy shows signs of attachment disorder and difficulty forming appropriate relationships with authority figures. The therapeutic placement will address these issues through structured programming and consistent boundaries. The clinical language struck Marcus as fundamentally misunderstanding Tommy's situation and character. What Hayes described as attachment disorder was actually Tommy's healthy caution about trusting adults who had demonstrated their unreliability, and his difficulty with authority figures reflected his accurate assessment that many of them approached him with predetermined assumptions rather than genuine interest in understanding his perspective. Director Hayes, I'd like to formally request a placement review meeting where Tommy's case can be discussed by all relevant parties, Marcus said, knowing that he was pushing against institutional resistance but feeling compelled to advocate for what he believed Tommy needed. Hayes's tone shifted to barely concealed irritation at Marcus's persistence in challenging her professional judgment. Mr. Chen, I need to be very clear with you about something. You are not Tommy's legal guardian, you are not a licensed social worker, and you are not qualified to make recommendations about child placement. You are a cemetery worker who happened to be present when Tommy needed emergency assistance. The dismissal was harsh and absolute, delivered with the kind of condescending authority that Marcus recognized as designed to end discussion rather than engage with his concerns. Hayes continued speaking with the confidence of someone who believed that institutional hierarchy automatically validated her decisions and invalidated any challenges to her expertise. Tommy will be transferred to the Hendricks farm on Friday morning, and I strongly recommend that you begin preparing him for this transition rather than encouraging unrealistic expectations about alternative arrangements, Hayes concluded. Your continued interference in this case is not helpful to Tommy's adjustment and may actually be harmful to his long-term welfare. Marcus felt the familiar surge of protective anger that had once motivated his best work as a child advocate, but which now carried additional weight because Tommy had become more than a professional case. The boy represented not just a child in need of services, but a person who had somehow become essential to Marcus's own sense of purpose and family. That evening, when Marcus arrived at Mrs. Brennan's facility for what he now knew might be one of his final visits with Tommy, he found the boy sitting alone in the common room with his notebook open to a fresh drawing. This picture showed a small figure standing beside a much larger one in what appeared to be a cemetery setting, both of them tending to flowers around a grave marked with a simple cross. Tommy looked up as Marcus approached, his dark eyes holding a combination of hope and resignation that suggested he had already been informed about the pending transfer. Without speaking, the boy closed his notebook and stood up with the careful dignity that Marcus had learned to recognize as Tommy's way of preparing himself for disappointment. "They told you about the farm, didn't they?" Marcus said gently, settling into the chair beside Tommy's usual spot. Tommy nodded solemnly, his small hands folded carefully in his lap. "Mrs. Brennan says it will be good for me to live with people who understand children like me, children who have had difficult experiences and need special help to learn how to trust adults properly." The clinical language sounded strange coming from Tommy's 7-year-old voice, clearly reflecting conversations in which adults had discussed his needs without necessarily asking for his own perspective on what might help him heal and grow. Marcus recognized the institutional approach to trauma treatment, which often prioritized professional intervention over natural healing through stable relationships. Marcus spent Thursday night at his kitchen table, working by lamplight on a document that he had not prepared in over 3 years. His fingers moved across the keyboard with muscle memory that surprised him, creating a comprehensive psychological assessment that drew upon every observation he had made about Tommy during their time together, every conversation they had shared, every glimpse into the boy's remarkable inner world. The assessment began with Tommy's developmental history as Marcus had pieced it together from their conversations, documenting the boy's extraordinary resilience in the face of multiple losses and his sophisticated coping mechanisms that had enabled him to provide complex medical care for his terminally ill sister. Marcus detailed Tommy's cognitive abilities, his emotional intelligence, his capacity for forming secure attachments when given consistent and trustworthy relationships. Most importantly, Marcus documented what the official evaluations had missed: Tommy's fundamental psychological health despite his traumatic experiences, his remarkable ability to process grief and loss in developmentally appropriate ways, and his clear preference for family-based care over institutional or therapeutic placement. The assessment painted a picture of a child who needed stability and belonging rather than intensive intervention. Marcus included his professional credentials on the document, listing his master's degree in social work from the State University, his licensure as a clinical social worker, and his specialized training in child psychology and trauma-informed care. He documented his 5 years of experience as a child welfare specialist and his additional 3 years working as a staff psychologist at the Children's Hospital before Emma's birth and his wife's death had forced him to step away from his career. Friday morning arrived gray and overcast, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything feel subdued and melancholy. Marcus called in sick to his job at the cemetery for the first time in 3 years, then drove to the county courthouse where Tommy's placement review was scheduled to take place in Judge Eleanor Walsh's courtroom. Director Hayes had agreed to the review meeting with obvious reluctance, viewing it as an unnecessary delay in Tommy's transfer to the therapeutic placement. She arrived at the courthouse with Mrs. Brennan and a young social worker named Kevin Martinez who had been assigned to complete Tommy's case documentation for the permanent placement process. Tommy sat quietly in the front row of the courtroom, wearing the same careful composure that Marcus had learned to recognize as the boy's way of protecting himself during adult proceedings that would determine his future. Emma sat beside her father, having insisted on coming to support Tommy despite Marcus's initial hesitation about involving her in what might become a contentious hearing. Judge Walsh, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes that missed very little, called the hearing to order and asked each party to state their position regarding Tommy's placement. Director Hayes spoke first, outlining the therapeutic benefits of the Hendricks Farm placement and emphasizing Tommy's need for specialized care to address what she termed his complex trauma responses. Mrs. Brennan testified about Tommy's adjustment difficulties at her facility, describing his withdrawal from group activities and his resistance to forming appropriate relationships with staff members. She characterized Marcus's frequent visits as problematic interference that had prevented Tommy from accepting his temporary placement and preparing for permanent care. When Judge Walsh called Marcus to speak, he rose slowly and approached the bench with the document he had prepared, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. He looked directly at Tommy as he began speaking, wanting the boy to understand that everything he was about to say came from genuine care and professional expertise. Your Honor, I am presenting a comprehensive psychological assessment of Tommy Rodriguez that I have prepared based on extensive observation and interaction with him over the past month, Marcus began, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. This assessment was prepared using standard clinical protocols and reflects my professional evaluation of Tommy's psychological state, developmental needs, and placement preferences. Director Hayes shifted in her seat with visible irritation, clearly preparing to object to Marcus's presumption in conducting unauthorized psychological evaluation. Judge Walsh, however, accepted the document and began reading with the careful attention of someone who understood the significance of what she was reviewing. Mr. Chen, Judge Walsh said after several minutes of silent reading, this is a remarkably thorough and professionally prepared assessment. Can you explain your qualifications for conducting this type of evaluation? Marcus felt the familiar weight of his professional identity settling around him like a garment he had stored away but never forgotten how to wear. Your Honor, I hold a master's degree in social work with specialization in child psychology from State University. I am a licensed clinical social worker with 8 years of experience in child welfare and trauma treatment. I worked for 5 years as a child protection specialist and 3 years as a staff psychologist at Children's Hospital before taking a leave of absence following my wife's death. The courtroom fell completely silent as the implications of Marcus's revelation settled over everyone present. Director Hayes's face registered shock and something that might have been embarrassment as she realized the extent to which she had dismissed someone whose qualifications exceeded her own. Mrs. Brennan stared at Marcus with the dawning understanding that she had been lecturing a trained professional about concepts he understood far better than she did. Judge Walsh continued reading the assessment with obvious interest, occasionally glancing up at Tommy and then back at the document. The evaluation painted a comprehensive picture of a psychologically healthy child whose primary need was stable family placement rather than therapeutic intervention, supported by detailed clinical observations and professional recommendations. Mr. Chen, Judge Walsh said finally, this assessment contradicts several conclusions reached by the county's evaluation team. Can you explain the discrepancies between your findings and the official psychological evaluation that was conducted last week? Marcus felt the weight of professional responsibility that he had carried for years before his retreat into the quiet world of cemetery groundskeeping. Your Honor, I believe the official evaluation failed to account for Tommy's remarkable adaptive capabilities and misinterpreted his healthy caution around authority figures as pathological attachment difficulties. Tommy's behavior reflects normal responses to abnormal circumstances rather than evidence of psychological dysfunction requiring intensive treatment. Judge Walsh set down Marcus's assessment and looked directly at Director Hayes, her expression reflecting both professional curiosity and growing concern about the county's handling of Tommy's case. Director Hayes, given Mr. Chen's credentials and his detailed evaluation, I'm troubled by the apparent disconnect between his findings and your department's recommendations. Can you explain why a licensed clinical social worker's assessment was not considered in your placement decisions? Hayes shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly struggling to reconcile her dismissive treatment of Marcus with the revelation of his professional qualifications. Your Honor, Mr. Chen did not identify himself as having relevant credentials when he initially contacted our department. Our intake procedures require that professional consultations be formally requested through proper channels, and we had no indication that he possessed the expertise to conduct psychological evaluations. Judge Walsh's expression suggested that she found Hayes's explanation inadequate, particularly given the serious implications of transferring a child to therapeutic placement without considering all available professional input. Mr. Chen, can you explain why you did not initially identify yourself as a trained social worker when you contacted the county about Tommy's situation? Marcus felt the weight of personal history that had led him to retreat from his professional identity, the grief and sense of failure that had made his credentials feel more like sources of pain than tools for helping others. Your Honor, after my wife died in a car accident 3 years ago, I found that I could no longer handle the emotional demands of child welfare work while raising my daughter alone. I took a position as a cemetery groundskeeper because it allowed me to provide stable care for Emma while stepping away from a career that had become too difficult to manage alongside single parenthood. The courtroom remained silent as Marcus continued, his voice carrying the honesty of someone who had learned to accept his own limitations while never losing sight of his deeper calling. When I encountered Tommy's situation, I initially tried to help as a concerned community member rather than as a professional, but his extraordinary needs and the system's apparent misunderstanding of his strengths compelled me to draw upon my training and experience. Judge Walsh nodded with understanding that suggested she recognized the complex relationship between personal trauma and professional capability. Mr. Chen, your assessment indicates that Tommy would benefit from placement with a family rather than in a therapeutic facility. Are you prepared to discuss what type of family environment you believe would best serve his needs? Marcus glanced at Tommy, who was watching the proceedings with the focused attention of someone who understood that his future was being decided through these adult conversations. The boy's dark eyes held hope but also the careful wariness of someone who had learned not to assume that good outcomes were guaranteed simply because they seemed logical or fair. Your Honor, based on my clinical evaluation and extensive interaction with Tommy, I believe he would thrive in a stable family environment with adults who recognize his resilience and intelligence rather than focusing primarily on his trauma history, Marcus replied, his voice carrying the confident authority of professional expertise combined with personal investment. Tommy has demonstrated remarkable psychological health despite his difficult experiences, and he needs placement that builds upon his strengths rather than treating him as fundamentally damaged. Judge Walsh turned her attention to Tommy directly, addressing him with the respect that Marcus had learned the boy both deserved and responded to positively. Tommy, I know this is a lot of adult conversation about your life, but I want to ask you directly what kind of home you would like to live in. What would make you feel safe and happy? Tommy straightened in his chair with the careful dignity that Marcus had come to recognize as the boy's way of rising to meet important moments. Your Honor, I would like to live with Mr. Chen and Emma if that's possible, Tommy said clearly, his 7-year-old voice carrying surprising steadiness. They make me feel like I'm part of a family instead of like I'm a problem that needs to be fixed. Mr. Chen understands about losing people you love, and Emma treats me like I'm her brother already. The simple honesty of Tommy's response seemed to crystallize something in Judge Walsh's understanding of the case. She looked back at Marcus with an expression that suggested she was seeing not just his professional qualifications but also his personal commitment to Tommy's welfare. Mr. Chen, are you formally requesting placement of Tommy in your home? Marcus felt his heart racing as he approached the moment that would either reunite their family or confirm Tommy's transfer to the distant therapeutic facility. Your Honor, yes, I am formally requesting placement of Tommy Rodriguez in my home. I believe I can provide him with a stable, loving family environment that will best support his continued healing and development. Director Hayes stood abruptly, clearly alarmed by the direction the hearing was taking. Your Honor, I must object to this irregular procedure. Mr. Chen has not undergone the standard home study process, background checks, or training requirements that we require for all foster placements. Allowing this placement would set a dangerous precedent and potentially expose the county to liability if problems arise. Judge Walsh raised her hand to quiet Hayes's objections, her expression suggesting that she was weighing multiple factors beyond simple adherence to standard procedures. Director Hayes, while I understand your concerns about protocol, I'm also concerned about the appropriateness of transferring a psychologically healthy child to therapeutic placement against the recommendation of a qualified clinical professional who has extensive knowledge of his specific needs and circumstances. The judge paused for several moments, reviewing Marcus's assessment one final time while considering the testimony she had heard from all parties. Tommy sat perfectly still, his small hands folded in his lap, waiting with the patience that Marcus had learned to recognize as one of the boy's most remarkable qualities. I'm going to order a 2-week delay in Tommy's transfer to allow for an expedited home study of Mr. Chen's residence and a comprehensive review of this case by an independent child welfare consultant, Judge Walsh announced finally. Tommy will remain in his current placement during this evaluation period, after which we will reconvene to make a final determination about his permanent placement. Marcus felt relief flood through him as he realized that Tommy would not be transferred immediately to the distant farm, that they had one precious time to demonstrate what their family could offer this extraordinary child. Across the courtroom, he could see Emma smiling broadly while Tommy's careful composure finally gave way to an expression of genuine hope. The 2 weeks that followed Judge Walsh's order passed with intense activity as Marcus underwent the expedited home study process while simultaneously preparing for what he knew would be the most important professional presentation of his career. The independent consultant assigned to review Tommy's case was Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a respected child psychologist whose reputation for thorough and unbiased evaluation had earned her the trust of family courts throughout the state. Dr. Hendricks spent extensive time interviewing Tommy, observing his interactions with Marcus and Emma, and reviewing all available documentation about his history and current psychological state. She also conducted detailed interviews with Marcus about his qualifications, his understanding of Tommy's needs, and his plans for supporting the boy's continued development and healing. Marcus found himself returning to professional literature that he had not touched in years, reviewing current best practices in trauma-informed care and attachment theory to ensure that his approach to Tommy's situation reflected the most recent developments in the field. The process felt like reclaiming a part of himself that he had set aside but never truly abandoned, professional skills and knowledge that had been dormant but not lost. Emma threw herself into the preparation process with 80-year-old enthusiasm, helping Marcus reorganize their small apartment to accommodate Tommy's belongings and creating detailed plans for how they would share space and responsibilities as an expanded family. Her natural acceptance of Tommy as her brother provided powerful evidence of the healthy family dynamics that could develop if the placement were approved. On the day of the final hearing, Marcus arrived at the courthouse carrying a comprehensive family integration plan that outlined specific strategies for supporting Tommy's transition, educational goals, therapeutic support if needed, and long-term stability planning. The document represented the synthesis of his professional expertise and personal commitment, a roadmap for helping Tommy heal while maintaining his remarkable resilience and strength. Dr. Hendricks presented her findings first, her testimony carrying the weight of professional objectivity that Judge Walsh clearly valued. Your Honor, my evaluation confirms Mr. Chen's assessment that Tommy Rodriguez is a psychologically healthy child whose primary need is stable family placement rather than therapeutic intervention. Tommy's attachment to Mr. Chen and Emma represents healthy relationship formation rather than problematic dependency, and his expressed preference for this placement reflects sound emotional judgment. Dr. Hendricks continued with detailed observations about Tommy's interactions within Marcus's family, noting the boy's immediate sense of belonging and his positive responses to the structure and affection that Marcus and Emma provided. She characterized the potential placement as highly beneficial for Tommy's continued development and recommended approval with standard post-placement monitoring. Director Hayes presented her department's revised position, acknowledging Marcus's qualifications while maintaining concerns about precedent and procedure. She had clearly been advised to approach the case more carefully given the revelation of Marcus's professional credentials and Judge Walsh's obvious interest in Tommy's individual needs rather than bureaucratic convenience. However, Hayes's testimony lacked the conviction of her earlier dismissive confidence, and Judge Walsh's questions revealed the director's limited understanding of current best practices in child placement and trauma-informed care. The contrast between Hayes's administrative focus and Marcus's clinical expertise became increasingly apparent as the hearing progressed. When Marcus was called to present his family integration plan, he approached the bench with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was proposing and why it would work. He outlined specific strategies for helping Tommy process his grief over Sophia's death, plans for maintaining his connection to her memory through regular cemetery visits and memorial activities, and detailed approaches to supporting his educational and social development. Most importantly, Marcus presented evidence of Tommy's own voice in the planning process, showing how the boy's preferences and insights had been incorporated into every aspect of the proposed placement. He demonstrated understanding of Tommy's need for agency and control over his own life after months of having decisions made for him by adults who barely knew him. Your Honor, Tommy has already experienced more loss and disruption than any child should endure, Marcus concluded, his voice carrying both professional authority and personal conviction. What he needs now is not another transition to strangers who view him primarily through the lens of his trauma, but rather the stability and unconditional love of a family that sees his strength, intelligence, and remarkable resilience. Judge Walsh asked Tommy to approach the bench one final time, speaking to him with the same respectful directness that had characterized their previous interaction. Tommy, you've heard all the adults talk about what they think would be best for you. I want to know what you think. If you could choose your own family, what would that look like? Tommy stood straight and tall, his 7-year-old frame carrying dignity that impressed everyone in the courtroom. Your Honor, I think a family should be people who love you even when you're sad, who help you remember the people you've lost without trying to make you forget them, and who believe you're strong enough to be happy again, Tommy said with remarkable clarity. Mr. Chen and Emma are already that kind of family for me." The wisdom and emotional intelligence evident in Tommy's response seemed to settle something definitive in Judge Walsh's mind. She looked around the courtroom at all the adults who had participated in determining this child's future, then returned her attention to Tommy with obvious respect for his insight and maturity. "After reviewing all testimony and evidence, I am approving the placement of Tommy Rodriguez with Marcus Chen and Emma Chen, pending completion of standard post-placement monitoring and support services," Judge Walsh announced, her voice carrying the authority of final decision. "This placement serves Tommy's best interests and provides him with the family stability that will best support his continued healing and development." Marcus felt tears of relief and joy as he realized that their fight had succeeded, that Tommy would finally have the permanent family he deserved. Across the courtroom, Emma was crying happily while Tommy's careful composure gave way to the first completely unguarded smile Marcus had seen from him since their initial meeting at Sophia's grave. 6 months later, Marcus stood in Riverside Cemetery on a bright spring morning, watching Tommy and Emma work together to plant the flower garden they had designed around Sophia's grave. The careful arrangements of colorful blooms created exactly the kind of peaceful, beautiful resting place that Tommy had envisioned in his drawings so many months earlier, a living memorial that honored his sister's memory while celebrating the hope and growth that had emerged from their shared loss. Tommy had settled into their family with the same remarkable adaptability that had enabled him to survive his months of independence, but now his resilience served joy rather than mere survival. He had started 3rd grade at Emma's school, where his intelligence and gentle maturity quickly earned him friends and the respect of teachers who marveled at his thoughtful questions and his instinctive kindness toward younger children who seemed lost or afraid. The adoption had been finalized just 2 weeks earlier, a legal ceremony that felt like both ending and beginning, the official recognition of bonds that had formed naturally through shared love and mutual choice. Tommy had asked if he could keep Rodriguez as his middle name, wanting to maintain connection to Sophia and his parents while also embracing his new identity as Tommy Rodriguez Chen, a name that honored both his past and his future. Marcus had returned to social work on a part-time basis, consulting with the county on complex child welfare cases while maintaining his position at the cemetery, which had become more than just employment but rather a source of peace and perspective that enhanced rather than replaced his professional calling. His colleagues welcomed him back with understanding and respect, recognizing that his personal experience with loss and recovery had deepened rather than diminished his effectiveness as an advocate for children. The combination of clinical expertise and lived experience made Marcus uniquely qualified to help other families navigate the intersection of grief and hope, trauma and resilience. He had developed a reputation for seeing strength where others saw only damage, for recognizing potential where others saw only problems, for understanding that healing often required family and belonging rather than institutional intervention. Emma had embraced her role as big sister with characteristic enthusiasm, teaching Tommy the card games she had mentioned during his stay at Mrs. Brennan's facility and learning from him the art of braiding friendship bracelets that Sophia had taught him during their months together. Their relationship had developed into genuine sibling affection marked by both typical childhood squabbles and deep mutual loyalty. Dr. Hendricks continued to visit their family quarterly as part of the post-placement monitoring requirements, but her reports consistently documented a thriving placement that exceeded all expectations for successful integration. Tommy's psychological assessments showed continued emotional growth and increasing confidence, while his academic performance and social development reflected the stability and support that family life provided. Director Hayes had remained in her position but had instituted new protocols for evaluating placement decisions, particularly in cases involving children with complex histories or when community members with relevant expertise offered input. The department had developed more sophisticated approaches to recognizing resilience and strength rather than focusing exclusively on deficits and pathology. On this particular morning, as Marcus watched his children tend Sophia's garden with careful devotion, he found himself thinking about the unexpected ways that loss and love could intersect, how a simple request from a desperate child could transform multiple lives in directions that none of them could have predicted. Tommy's question about burying his sister had led not just to Sophia's peaceful rest, but to the creation of a family bound together by choice and commitment rather than only biology. Tommy looked up from the flowers he was arranging, his face bright with the easy happiness that had replaced the careful composure he had worn like armor during those difficult months of uncertainty. Mr. Chen, he said, using the formal address that had evolved into a term of affection rather than distance, do you think Sophia would like knowing that her garden helps other people feel peaceful when they come to visit their families here? Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as he recognized the continued wisdom and empathy that made Tommy such an extraordinary child, his ability to see beyond his own experience to understand how his actions might comfort others who were grieving. Sophia would love knowing that her garden brings comfort to other families, Marcus replied, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had learned to trust in the continuation of love beyond physical presence. Emma stood up from her planting and brushed dirt from her hands, looking around the cemetery with the proprietary pride of someone who had helped create something beautiful and meaningful. This is the best garden in the whole cemetery, she announced with 80-year-old confidence. People are going to come here just to see Sophia's flowers, and they'll feel better about their own sad feelings. As they gathered their gardening tools and prepared to head home for lunch, Marcus realized that viewers around the world might be listening to this story of found family and second chances, wondering where their own journeys of loss and hope might lead them. If this story of unexpected family and the power of seeing beyond surface appearances had touched hearts across different time zones and cultures, then perhaps it had fulfilled its deeper purpose of reminding everyone that every person carries hidden worth waiting to be recognized and valued. Tommy took Marcus's hand as they walked toward the cemetery gates, his small fingers intertwining with larger ones in a gesture that had become natural and comforting for both of them. Their family had been forged through crisis and choice, through professional advocacy and personal love, through the recognition that sometimes the most important qualifications for caring for a child were not credentials or procedures but rather the willingness to see strength where others saw only struggle, to offer family where others offered only services. Behind them, Sophia's garden bloomed in the morning sunlight, a living testament to the enduring power of love to create beauty and hope even in places marked by loss, a reminder that every ending could also be a beginning for those brave enough to plant seeds of possibility in even the most unlikely ground.